I found the testimonies buried in the deepest vaults beneath the ruins of Isstvan 5, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived 10 millennia of neglect. They were written by those who had known Horus before his fall. Warriors, remembrancers, even a few of his own sons who had witnessed the transformation of their beloved Primarch from the Emperor's greatest champion into his most terrible enemy. Their words carried a weight that official histories could never capture. The intimate anguish of watching someone you loved become something monstrous. The first account was penned by Captain Terra Torgadon of the Luna Wolves, his elegant script marred by what appeared to be tear stains. "I write this, knowing it may be my final testimony," he began. "The War Master I followed to glory across 1,000 worlds is gone, replaced by something that wears his face but speaks with the voice of damnation. Yet I remember him as he was, and I believe that memory deserves preservation, even if none survive to read these words." As I read by candlelight in my study high above the hive spires of Malacandria, I found myself transported not to the blood-soaked battlefields of the Heresy, but to quieter moments when a demigod had walked among mortals and been loved for his humanity rather than feared for his power. These testimonies revealed a truth that propaganda had buried. Horus Lupercal had not been born evil. His corruption was a tragedy of the highest order, the systematic destruction of everything noble in one of the finest beings the galaxy had ever produced. What follows is their story, told in the voices of those who witnessed it unfold. It is not a tale of simple villainy, but of how the brightest light can cast the darkest shadow, and how love itself can become the instrument of the most devastating betrayal. Chapter 1. The First Found. The earliest testimony comes from a navigator named Yesid Nermaud, whose journals chronicle the expedition that discovered the young Primarch on the mining world of Thonia. Her words paint a picture of a first contact that would reshape the galaxy's destiny. "We translated into the Chthonian system on the 44th day of the year," she wrote, her navigator's precision evident in every detail. "The planet appeared dead from orbit, a world stripped of everything valuable, its surface scarred by generations of mining operations. Yet our augurs detected massive energy signatures from the underground cities, and more importantly, they detected something else. A psychic presence of such magnitude that it made our astropaths weep. Chthonian was a world that should have broken any child forced to survive there. The mining gangs that controlled the planet's depths were savage, territorial creatures who measured worth in violence and cunning. Yet, when the Emperor's expedition descended into those tunnels, they found that a 16-year-old giant had not merely survived, but thrived, uniting the fractious gangs under his leadership through a combination of martial prowess and unshakable charisma. I was present when the Emperor first laid eyes upon his son, Navigator Nermaud recorded. Horus, though he had not yet taken that name, stood at the head of a delegation of gang leaders, their scarred faces radiating absolute devotion to this young man who had given them something they had never known: hope. The Primarch was magnificent even then, his presence filling the chamber like sunlight. Yet he showed no arrogance before his father. When the Emperor spoke his name, Horus fell to one knee, not in submission, but in recognition of a bond that transcended explanation. The integration of Horus with the 16th Legion proceeded with a smoothness that astonished military observers. Within months of his discovery, the Luna Wolves had been transformed from an effective but unremarkable fighting force into something approaching legend. Yet it was not their tactical improvements that impressed witnesses most. It was the palpable change in their morale. Brother Captain Abaddon spoke to me about the transformation, Navigator Nermaud noted. He had served in the Legion for decades before their Primarch was found. leading companies with competence, if not inspiration. We knew we were effective warriors, he told me, but we did not know we could be magnificent. Horus showed us not just how to fight, but why to fight. Under his leadership, we became more than the sum of our parts. We became a brotherhood worthy of the Great Crusade's highest ideals. The early campaigns under Horus's leadership established patterns that would define the Luna Wolves for the next 6 decades. Unlike some of his brothers who specialized in particular forms of warfare, Horus displayed a versatility that bordered on the supernatural. He could inspire savage loyalty in hardened criminals, negotiate delicate diplomatic settlements with suspicious planetary governors, and lead from the front in the most desperate assaults with equal facility. I accompanied the 63rd expedition during the compliance of Zenobia, Navigator Nermaud recorded. The world's ruling council had declared their intention to resist imperial authority, yet within 3 days of Horus's arrival, they were begging to be allowed to join the Imperium. He had not threatened them or demonstrated force. He had simply spoken to them about humanity's potential, about the glory that awaited those who joined their strength to the Great Crusade. When he finished, grown men were weeping with the desire to serve. Yet even in these early days, careful observers noted aspects of Horus's character that would later prove significant. His need for approval, his sensitivity to perceived slights, his tendency to take personal responsibility for failures that were beyond any individual's control. These traits endeared him to his followers, but also created vulnerabilities that would eventually be exploited. He carried the weight of every casualty personally, Navigator Nermaud wrote. After particularly costly battles, I would find him alone in his chambers, studying casualty reports with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When I asked him about this habit, he replied that every warrior who died under his command deserved to be remembered as an individual rather than a statistic. It was a noble sentiment, but I began to worry about the toll such self-imposed burdens might take on even a Primarch's psyche. The Emperor's growing reliance on Horus became apparent to all who served in the expeditionary fleets. While other Primarchs were given specific theaters of operation or specialized roles, Horus found himself called upon for the most challenging missions, the most delicate negotiations, the most crucial battles. This trust was not misplaced. His success rate was unparalleled among his brothers, but it also isolated him from the camaraderie that sustained the other Primarchs. I watched him mediate a dispute between Fulgrim and Perturabo during the conquest of Lairan, Navigator Nermaud documented. Both Primarchs had legitimate grievances, and lesser leaders might have let their pride escalate the conflict into something damaging. Horus resolved the matter with such skill that both brothers left the meeting convinced that he had sided with them. Yet, when they were gone, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "Father asks much of me," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if he asks too much." The first signs of the doubt that would eventually doom Horus appeared during this period, though none recognized them for what they were. His questions about the Emperor's long-term plans, his concerns about the sustainability of constant expansion, his growing unease with the Imperium's increasingly authoritarian methods, all seemed like the natural concerns of a thoughtful leader grappling with complex challenges. He spoke to me about the nature of conquest, Navigator Nermaud wrote in what would prove to be one of her final entries. We had just completed the pacification of 3 systems whose populations had initially welcomed us as liberators, only to grow resentful as imperial administrators imposed new regulations and taxation. "We bring them freedom from xenosuppression," Horus told me. "But what freedom do they truly gain if they simply exchange alien masters for human ones?" I assured him that such concerns showed the nobility of his character, but I could see that my words brought him little comfort. The navigator's final observation proved to be unnervingly prescient. The War Master carries burdens that would crush lesser beings, yet he shows no sign of yielding to their weight. His loyalty to the Emperor is absolute, his dedication to the Great Crusade unwavering. Yet I sometimes wonder what might happen if that loyalty were ever tested by choices between competing goods, or if his faith in our cause were challenged by evidence that our methods might not match our ideals. Horus's greatest strength has always been his humanity, his ability to understand and empathize with those he leads. I pray that this same quality never becomes a weakness that our enemies might exploit. Chapter 2. The Perfect Son. The testimony that follows comes from Malcador the Sigillite himself, recorded in the private chambers beneath the imperial palace during the darkest days of the heresy. His words carry the weight of a man who had watched the Emperor's greatest triumph become his most terrible tragedy. I was present for every significant moment in Horus's development. The Sigillite's weak voice was preserved by ancient recording devices. From his first meeting with his father to the day he was elevated to War Master, I watched the Emperor pour his hopes and dreams into this remarkable son. Of all the Primarchs, Horus alone seemed to understand not just what the Emperor was trying to accomplish, but why it mattered. The bond between the Emperor and Horus transcended the normal relationship between father and son, becoming something closer to true partnership. While other Primarchs excelled in specific areas of leadership or warfare, Horus demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to understand his father's vision and translate it into practical action. I observed their private meetings, Malcador recorded. Other Primarchs would receive orders and execute them with varying degrees of success. Horus would receive objectives and somehow divine the deeper purpose behind them, often achieving results that exceeded even the Emperor's expectations. During the conquest of the Arc Reach cluster, the Emperor mentioned in passing that the region's industrial capacity would be valuable for future expansion. Horus not only secured the manufactorums but also implemented infrastructure improvements that tripled their output within a decade. The Emperor's pride in Horus was evident to all who served in the inner circles of power. Unlike his sometimes distant relationships with his other sons, his interactions with Horus carried a warmth that bordered on the familial. Yet this favoritism, while understandable, also created dynamics that would prove catastrophic. The other Primarchs noticed the special treatment, Malcador noted with the benefit of a hindsight. Most accepted it gracefully, recognizing Horus's exceptional capabilities. Others, however, began to feel that their own achievements were diminished by comparison. Perturabo, in particular, grew resentful of the praise heaped upon Horus, while his own victories were treated as routine accomplishments. The Ulanor Crusade marked the apotheosis of Horus's ascendancy. The largest military operation since the unification of Terra required coordination between multiple legions, imperial army formations, and Mechanicus forces on a scale that tested even the Emperor's organizational abilities. The decision to place Horus in tactical command of the operation surprised some observers, but the results vindicated the Emperor's judgment. The campaign showcased every aspect of Horus's genius, Malcador recorded. His strategic planning was flawless, his tactical flexibility extraordinary, and his ability to coordinate the efforts of his prideful brothers was nothing short of miraculous. When Leman Russ and Perturabo clashed over siege approaches, Horus resolved their dispute by incorporating both strategies into a synergistic whole that was superior to either individual plan. The celebration that followed Ulanor's fall should have been the crowning moment of Horus's career. The Emperor's decision to elevate him to War Master, granting him authority over all military operations of the Great Crusade, represented unprecedented trust in a Primarch's capabilities. Yet even this triumph contained the seeds of future tragedy. "I advised against the promotion," Malcador admitted with obvious regret. "Not because I doubted Horus's capabilities, but because I feared the isolation it would create." The Emperor's decision to withdraw from active command to focus on the Webway project left Horus bearing responsibilities that had previously been shared. I warned that even a Primarch might buckle under such weight, but the Emperor was confident that his favorite son would rise to meet any challenge. The early years of Horus's tenure as War Master seemed to vindicate the Emperor's faith. The Great Crusade continued to achieve unprecedented victories, with Horus demonstrating the same masterful coordination of resources and personalities that had characterized his earlier commands. Yet, careful observers began to notice subtle changes in the War Master's demeanor. He began asking more questions about the Emperor's long-term plans, Malcador recorded. Previously, Horus had been content to execute his father's vision without requiring detailed explanations. Now, he wanted to understand the reasoning behind every directive, the ultimate purpose of each conquest. When I explained that some knowledge was too dangerous to share openly, he accepted my words, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. The burden of command began to take its toll in ways that were not immediately apparent. Horus's legendary stamina remained unimpaired, his tactical brilliance undiminished. But those closest to him noticed a gradual change in his perspective on the Great Crusade's methods and objectives. "He came to me after the compliance of Molech," Malcador noted. The planetary government had surrendered immediately upon learning of the War Master's arrival. Yet Horus seemed troubled rather than pleased by this easy victory. "They submit out of fear rather than understanding," he told me. "We have become so powerful that worlds yield to us not because they believe in our cause, but because they cannot imagine resisting us." Is this truly the unity my father envisioned? The philosophical questions that increasingly occupied Horus's thoughts reflected a growing disconnection between his idealistic nature and the harsh realities of galactic conquest. His early experiences on Chthonia had taught him that strength without justice was mere tyranny, yet the demands of the Great Crusade seemed to require ever more coercive methods. I found him in the trophy chamber one night, staring at the banners captured from defeated enemies, Malcador recorded. When I asked what troubled him, he gestured to a standard taken from the Interrex, a human civilization we had destroyed for their refusal to abandon their Xenos allies. "They were good people," he said quietly. "Their society was more just and prosperous than most imperial worlds. Yet we ended them because they refused to conform to our vision of purity. How many other civilizations have we condemned for the crime of choosing different paths?" The Emperor's continued absence from the front lines of the Crusade compounded Horus's growing isolation. While other Primarchs could turn to their father for guidance and support, Horus found himself forced to make increasingly difficult decisions without the counsel that had previously sustained him. His requests for audience with the Emperor became more frequent, Malcador noted. Yet the demands of the Webway project meant that such meetings were rare and brief. When they did occur, the Emperor's attention was often divided between his son's concerns and the technical challenges of his secret work. I watched Horus leave these encounters with expressions of growing frustration and hurt. The Sigillite's final observations about this period carry the weight of terrible prescience. I knew that Horus was struggling with the burdens placed upon him, but I believed his strength and loyalty would see him through any crisis. The Emperor's confidence in his favorite son was absolute, and that confidence blinded us all to the warning signs that were becoming increasingly apparent. We saw questions where we should have seen doubt, philosophical concerns where we should have seen the beginnings of rebellion. By the time we realized how far Horus had fallen, it was already too late to save him, or to save ourselves from the consequences of our blindness. Chapter 3. The Seeds of Doubt. The account that follows was written by First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon during his imprisonment following the siege of Terra. Though his words must be viewed through the lens of his eventual corruption, his insights into Horus's transformation provide crucial understanding of how the greatest of the Emperor's sons could fall so completely. The War Master began to change after Davin, Abaddon wrote, his script betraying none of the chaos corruption that would later consume him. Not in obvious ways that outsiders might notice, but in subtle shifts of perspective that only those closest to him could perceive. He questioned orders that he once would have executed without hesitation. He lingered over casualty reports with an intensity that worried his staff. Most significantly, he began to speak of the Emperor not with the unqualified admiration that had once defined their relationship, but with the careful respect one shows to a distant superior. The compliance of Davin had appeared routine by the standards of the Great Crusade. The world's primitive population posed no significant military threat, and their swift surrender suggested that the operation would conclude with minimal bloodshed. Yet something about the planet itself seemed to affect Horus in ways that his closest advisors struggled to understand. The War Master spent hours alone in his private chambers, studying reports about Davin's history and culture, Abaddon recorded. When I asked about his unusual interest in what appeared to be a minor conquest, he replied that every world we brought into compliance deserved understanding, not mere domination. While this sentiment was characteristically noble, the intensity of his focus seemed disproportionate to the planet's strategic significance. The lodge meetings that had long been a feature of the Luna Wolves' culture took on new significance during this period. What had previously been informal gatherings focused on brotherhood and mutual support began to involve more philosophical discussions about the nature of the Great Crusade and humanity's ultimate destiny. Chaplain Erebus of the Word, bearers became a frequent participant in our lodge gatherings, Abaddon noted. His insights into theology and philosophy impressed many of our warriors, myself included. He spoke eloquently about the need for spiritual foundations to support the Imperium's temporal power, arguments that resonated with those of us who had grown concerned about the moral implications of our expanding empire. The influence of the warrior lodges spread beyond the Luna Wolves to other legions within Horus's command structure. These interlegion gatherings created bonds of brotherhood that transcended traditional organizational boundaries, but they also provided channels for ideas and influences that bypassed official command structures. Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children spoke passionately about the pursuit of perfection in all endeavors, Abaddon recorded. His words inspired many to strive for excellence that went beyond mere tactical effectiveness. Similarly, Captain Typhon of the Death Guard shared insights about endurance and sacrifice that helped us understand our role as guardians of humanity's future. Yet, beneath these apparently positive developments, more troubling currents began to flow. The philosophical discussions that enhanced the lodge's appeal also created opportunities for doubt and dissent to spread in ways that traditional military discipline could not easily address. We began to question aspects of imperial doctrine that we had previously accepted without examination, Abaddon wrote. The prohibition against religion seemed increasingly arbitrary given the Emperor's own godlike powers. The aggressive expansion of the Crusade appeared to prioritize conquest over genuine human welfare. Most troublingly, the Emperor's withdrawal from active leadership suggested either declining interest in his own project or the pursuit of secret agendas that he did not trust his sons to understand. The War Master's growing receptivity to these questions reflected changes in his own perspective that went beyond simple philosophical evolution. Those who had served with Horus longest began to notice that his legendary optimism was being tempered by something approaching cynicism. He spoke to me about the nature of truth during the voyage to Isstvan, Abaddon recorded. The imperial truth that had once seemed like a beacon of enlightenment now appeared to him as a potentially limiting doctrine that prevented humanity from exploring all avenues of knowledge and power. Perhaps, he said, our Father's commitment to reason and science blinds him to other forms of understanding that might benefit our species. The events on Murder, where the expedition encountered the sophisticated human civilization of the Interrex, proved to be a crucial turning point in Horus's development. The Interrex's successful integration of human and Xenos populations challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial doctrine, while demonstrating alternative models of galactic civilization. The War Master was clearly impressed by what the Interrex had achieved, Abaddon noted. Their society combined technological advancement with genuine social harmony, creating conditions that many imperial worlds could only envy. When their leaders spoke about the dangers of chaos corruption, Horus listened with interest rather than dismissing their concerns as superstition. The theft of the Kinabrak Anathame from the Interrex's museum created the crisis that would ultimately doom Horus, though none recognized the significance of the weapon at the time. The suspicion that fell upon the Luna Wolves for the theft strained relations with the Interrex beyond repair, leading to the military confrontation that Horus had hoped to avoid. The war that followed sickened the War Master in ways that previous campaigns had not, Abaddon recorded. He had genuinely hoped to bring the Interrex into the Imperium through negotiation rather than conquest, viewing their civilization as a valuable addition to humanity's growing empire. When diplomatic failure forced us to destroy them, Horus spoke of it as one of the Great Crusade's greatest tragedies. The destruction of the Interrex marked a watershed moment in Horus's relationship with his father's vision. The loss of what he viewed as a genuinely worthy human civilization to imperial inflexibility planted doubts about the wisdom of the Emperor's approach that would later be exploited by more malevolent influences. He began to speak of alternative approaches to galactic unification, Abaddon wrote. Rather than demanding absolute conformity to imperial doctrine, perhaps the Crusade could accommodate different models of human development. Instead of destroying civilizations that refused to submit, we might find ways to coexist with those who posed no actual threat to our broader objectives. Yet these reasonable concerns were gradually corrupted by influences that Abaddon and his battle brothers failed to recognize until it was too late. The lodge meetings that had begun as forums for legitimate philosophical discussion became vehicles for more sinister purposes. Erebus spoke increasingly of the powers that existed beyond the material realm, Abaddon recorded. He argued that the Emperor's prohibition against acknowledging these forces left humanity vulnerable to threats that could only be countered through understanding and alliance. When some of our number expressed skepticism about such claims, he offered to provide proof through direct demonstration. The gradual acceptance of chaos influence within the lodges proceeded with such subtlety that even veterans like Abaddon failed to recognize the corruption taking hold in their midst. What appeared to be expanded knowledge and enhanced capabilities were actually the first steps toward damnation. The visions that some lodge members began experiencing seemed to provide valuable intelligence about enemy movements and intentions, Abaddon wrote. The enhanced physical capabilities that others developed appeared to represent natural evolution of Astartes' physiology. Only in retrospect can I see that we were being systematically corrupted by forces that understood our desires and fears better than we understood ourselves. Abaddon's final observations about this period reveal the tragic irony of Horus's fall. The War Master's greatest virtues became the instruments of his destruction. His love for his warriors made him receptive to influences that promised to protect them from harm. His desire for truth led him to embrace lies that masqueraded as hidden knowledge. His commitment to humanity's welfare blinded him to the price that would be demanded for the power he was offered. We believed we were becoming stronger and wiser, never realizing that we were being prepared for a betrayal that would tear the galaxy apart. Chapter 4. The Wound at Davin. The testimony that follows comes from Apothecary Vadan Singh of the Luna Wolves, whose intimate knowledge of Primarch physiology makes his account of Horus's wounding and subsequent corruption particularly valuable. His words reveal how a single moment of vulnerability became the gateway for humanity's darkest nightmare. The attack came without warning, Singh wrote, his medici training evident in the clinical precision of his description. The Kinnebrak anatheme struck the War Master in a gap between his armor plates, penetrating several centimeters before his enhanced healing began to close the wound. By any rational assessment, the injury was minor, a scratch that should have healed within hours. Yet, from the moment the blade touched his flesh, I knew that something terrible had occurred. The weapon that wounded Horus had been stolen from the Interex's museum, though the true significance of its theft would not become apparent until much later. The anatheme was not merely a physical blade, but a conduit for warp energies that could corrupt even the enhanced physiology of a Primarch. The wound refused to heal properly, Singh recorded. Despite multiple treatments with the finest medici technology available to the legions, the injury continued to fester and spread. More troubling still were the fever dreams that began to plague the War Master, visions so vivid and disturbing that he would wake screaming in languages that none of our scholars could identify. The Luna Wolves' senior staff found themselves facing a crisis for which their training had not prepared them. Primarchs were supposed to be nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, their enhanced biology capable of recovering from injuries that would kill even a space marine. The possibility that their gene father might actually die from what appeared to be a simple wound was unthinkable. Captain Abaddon demanded that I exhaust every resource at our disposal, Singh noted. The finest chirurgeons in the Imperium were summoned by astropathic message. Ancient healing technologies were retrieved from sealed archives, and even experimental xenobiology techniques were considered. Yet nothing we attempted had any significant effect on the War Master's condition. As Horus's condition deteriorated, his fever dreams became increasingly vivid and prophetic. In his delirium, he spoke of visions that seemed to reveal hidden truths about the Emperor's ultimate plans for humanity and the galaxy. He raved about the Emperor's true nature, Singh recorded with obvious reluctance. According to his visions, our father was not the benevolent unifier that we had believed, but a would-be god seeking to ascend to divinity through the sacrifice of his sons. The Great Crusade was not about human liberation, but about gathering the psychic energy necessary to fuel the Emperor's transformation. The desperation of Horus's condition led to decisions that would later prove catastrophic. When conventional medicine failed to heal the War Master, his advisors began to consider alternatives that violated fundamental Imperial doctrine about the dangers of warp contact. First, Chaplain Erebus approached me with a proposal, Singh wrote. The indigenous population of Davin possessed healing traditions that incorporated what he termed spiritual medicine, techniques that worked through manipulation of energies beyond the purely physical. While such practices violated the Imperial Truth's prohibition against superstition, Erebus argued that exceptional circumstances justified exceptional measures. The lodge members who had grown close to Erebus proved receptive to his suggestions. Their love for their Primarch and their desperation to save him overcame their doctrinal reservations about engaging with practices that bordered on sorcery. The ritual that followed was presented as a healing ceremony, Singh recorded. The Davanite shamans spoke of calling upon ancient powers to cleanse the poison from the War Master's blood and restore his strength. What they were actually doing, I now realize, was opening doorways between the material realm and the warp that allowed malevolent entities to establish direct contact with the Horus's soul. The ceremony took place in chambers deep beneath Davan's surface, in spaces that predated human settlement of the world. The architecture itself seemed designed to amplify psychic energies, focusing them in ways that made the barrier between realities dangerously thin. The War Master's fever broke during the ritual, Singh noted. His vital signs stabilized, his wound began to heal, and his consciousness returned with apparent clarity. Yet those of us with medical training could sense that something fundamental had changed about his physiology. His gene pattern remained stable, but his psychic emanations had altered in ways that our instruments could barely detect. The entity that spoke through Horus during the ritual's climax was not immediately recognizable as alien. Its voice carried the War Master's familiar tones. Its words reflected his known concerns and priorities. Yet something about its presence felt fundamentally wrong to those sensitive enough to perceive such distinctions. It spoke of the Emperor's betrayal, Singh recorded. The entity claimed to represent Horus's own subconscious mind, freed from the constraints of loyalty and conditioning to see the truth about their father's nature. According to these revelations, the Emperor had always intended to cast aside his sons once they had served their purpose, replacing them with more easily controlled successors. The visions that accompanied Horus's recovery painted a picture of the future that was both terrifying and seductive. The entity showed him glimpses of what the galaxy might become if the Emperor's plans were allowed to proceed unchallenged. A sterile realm where humanity was reduced to mere components in a vast machine serving the Emperor's godlike ambitions. The alternative it offered was intoxicating, Singh wrote. A galaxy where humanity could reach its true potential through alliance with powers that existed beyond the material realm. These entities, the voice claimed, sought not to dominate humanity but to elevate it, offering gifts of knowledge and power that the Emperor's narrow vision would never permit. When Horus awakened from the ritual, his apparent recovery was celebrated throughout the expedition fleet. Yet, careful observers noted subtle changes in the War Master's demeanor that suggested his ordeal had affected him more profoundly than was immediately apparent. His strategic thinking became even more sophisticated, Singh recorded. He began to coordinate the activities of multiple legions with an efficiency that bordered on prescience. His ability to predict enemy movements and anticipate political developments improved to levels that amazed even his veteran staff. We attributed these enhancements to natural recovery and resumed confidence, never suspecting that we were witnessing the early manifestations of supernatural influence. The corruption that had taken root in Horus's soul spread outward from him like a contagion, affecting first his closest advisors and then spreading through the lodge networks to other legions. Yet this infection was so subtle that even those it touched failed to recognize its presence. The lodge meetings took on new significance after Davan, Singh noted. What had previously been philosophical discussions became planning sessions for practical action. We began to develop strategies for approaching other Primarchs, identifying those who might be receptive to our concerns about the Emperor's true nature. The urgency we felt to protect our brothers from the Emperor's supposed betrayal overrode our remaining reservations about challenging established authority. Singh's final observations about this period carry the weight of medical expertise combined with tragic hindsight. I realize now that what we witnessed on Davin was not healing, but infection. The entity that saved Horus's life demanded a price that none of us understood at the time, his soul itself. The War Master who emerged from that ritual chamber was no longer the noble figure we had followed across the galaxy, but a carefully crafted deception designed to turn the Emperor's greatest weapon against him. By the time we recognized the truth, we had already become complicit in the galaxy's destruction. Chapter 5: The Seduction of Brothers. The account that follows was written by Captain Garviel Loken of the Luna Wolves, one of the few members of Horus's inner circle who ultimately rejected the corruption. His perspective provides crucial insight into how the War Master's fall spread through the lodges to corrupt entire legions. The change in Horus was subtle but pervasive, Loken wrote from his exile following the Isstvan atrocity. He retained all the surface characteristics that had made him beloved: his charisma, his strategic brilliance, his apparent concern for his warriors. Yet something fundamental had shifted in his motivations. Where once he had sought to inspire through example, now he worked to convince through argument. Where once he had led from the front, now he preferred to operate through intermediaries and carefully orchestrated events. The lodge meetings that had once focused on brotherhood and mutual support became vehicles for systematic indoctrination. Horus himself rarely attended these gatherings, but his influence permeated them through carefully chosen representatives who understood their role in the larger corruption. Erebus became the primary conduit for the War Master's new philosophy, Loken recorded. He spoke with religious fervor about the need to save the Emperor from his own worst impulses, about the duty of loyal sons to prevent their father from making decisions that would damn the entire species. His arguments were sophisticated and emotionally compelling, addressing genuine concerns that many of us had developed about the direction of the Great Crusade. The recruitment of other Primarchs proceeded with careful attention to their individual psychology and circumstances. Rather than attempting to convert them through direct confrontation, Horus identified those who might be receptive to specific aspects of his evolving worldview. Fulgrim was the first to be approached, Loken noted. The War Master exploited his brother's perfectionist nature, suggesting that the Emperor's vision for humanity was flawed because it failed to account for the species' potential for true transcendence. The corruption was presented not as betrayal, but as loyal correction, an attempt to perfect their father's imperfect plan. The Emperor's children. Primarch proved remarkably susceptible to arguments that appealed to his desire for continuous improvement. The subtle implication that accepting limitations was itself a form of failure resonated with psychological patterns that Chaos had been preparing to exploit for decades. Fulgrim's conversion was gradual but thorough, Loken observed. He began to speak of perfection in terms that went beyond physical or tactical excellence, describing spiritual and psychic development that required embracing powers the Emperor had forbidden. When his brother Marines expressed concern about these new interests, Fulgrim assured them that true loyalty sometimes required transcending the letter of orders to fulfill their spirit. Angron presented different challenges and opportunities for corruption. His brutal conditioning on Nuceria had left him with rage issues that conventional therapy could not address, making him receptive to any philosophy that validated his fury and offered outlets for his aggression. I found the testimonies buried in the deepest vaults beneath the ruins of Isstvan V, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived 10 millennia of neglect. They were written by those who had known Horus before his fall, warriors, remembrancers, even a few of his own sons who had witnessed the transformation of their beloved Primarch from the Emperor's greatest champion into his most terrible enemy. Their words carried a weight that official histories could never capture. The intimate anguish of watching someone you loved become something monstrous. The first account was penned by Captain Tarek Torgadon of the Luna Wolves, his elegant script marred by what appeared to be tear stains. "I write this knowing it may be my final testimony," he began. The approach to Angron was brilliantly calculated, Loken wrote. Rather than trying to appeal to his reason, which the butcher's nails had largely destroyed, Horus spoke to his rage. He painted the Emperor as the ultimate tyrant, the figure responsible for all the suffering that Angron and his brothers had endured. The promise of revenge against the architect of their pain proved irresistible to a Primarch whose capacity for forgiveness had been surgically removed. Mortarian's recruitment required a different strategy entirely. The Death Guard Primarch's hatred of Psykers and suspicion of any power that smacked of sorcery made him an unlikely candidate for chaos corruption. Yet Horus found ways to present his new allegiances that appealed to Mortarian's core beliefs. The War Master convinced Mortarian that he was fighting against the Emperor's psychic tyranny, Loken recorded. He presented chaos not as supernatural power, but as natural force, the universe's own response to the artificial constraints that the Emperor sought to impose. By framing corruption as liberation from psychic control, Horus made damnation seem like resistance. Perhaps the most tragic recruitment was that of Magnus the Red. The Thousand Sons. Primarch's desperate attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal had been twisted by the War Master into justification for the very rebellion it sought to prevent. Magnus's destruction of the Webway project played directly into Horus's hands, Loken noted with obvious pain. The Emperor's rage at his son's disobedience created the perfect conditions for corruption. When Magnus found himself condemned for trying to save the Imperium, Horus was there to offer understanding and support. The fallen War Master presented himself as the only father figure willing to accept Magnus despite his mistakes. The systematic corruption of these Primarchs created cascading effects throughout their legions. Space Marines who had sworn absolute loyalty to their gene fathers found themselves following orders that led them away from the Emperor's service without realizing the ultimate destination of their journey. The genius of Horus's approach was its gradualism, Loken observed. No one was asked to commit obvious treason immediately. Instead, we were encouraged to question, to think independently, to consider whether blind obedience was truly the highest form of loyalty. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, even as the cumulative effect led us toward damnation. The lodge networks that had originally fostered brotherhood between legions became channels for coordinating the rebellion. What had begun as informal gatherings of warriors sharing common concerns evolved into a shadow command structure that could organize galaxy-spanning conspiracy. Captain Lucius spoke eloquently about the need for warriors to think beyond their immediate orders, Loken recorded. He argued that true excellence required understanding not just how to execute commands, but why those commands served the greater good. When orders came that seemed to conflict with that greater good, he suggested, loyal warriors had a duty to seek clarification or even gentle correction. The corruption of the Mechanicus proved crucial to the rebellion's success. Without the technical expertise and manufacturing capacity of Mars, Horus's forces would have been unable to sustain a prolonged campaign against the Imperium. Yet bringing the tech priests into the conspiracy required careful manipulation of their unique psychology. Kelbor Hal was convinced that the Emperor was suppressing technological knowledge that could benefit humanity, Loken noted. Horus presented the rebellion not as an attempt to destroy the Imperium, but as an effort to free it from artificial constraints on progress. The promise of unrestricted research and development proved irresistible to Mechanicus factions that had grown frustrated with Imperial limitations, The timeline for open rebellion was carefully calibrated to maximize the traitor's advantages while minimizing the loyalists' ability to respond effectively. Horus used his authority as War Master to position his forces strategically throughout the galaxy, while gradually isolating potential opponents. The drop site massacre at Isstvan was the culmination of years of careful planning, Loken wrote. 7 legions were drawn into what they believed was a straightforward punitive action against rebels. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a killing field where brother fought brother in the most horrific betrayal in human history. The psychological impact of the betrayal extended far beyond its military consequences. The revelation that the Emperor's most trusted son had turned against him shattered the foundational assumptions upon which the Great Crusade had been built. We had believed ourselves to be part of something perfect, Loken reflected. The discovery that our leaders could fall to corruption, that our brothers could become enemies, that our cause itself might be flawed. These realizations destroyed the certainty that had sustained us through decades of war. For many warriors, the choice became not between loyalty and betrayal, but between meaning and meaninglessness. Yet, even in the depths of the crisis, some found the strength to resist corruption and maintain their loyalty to the Emperor's original vision. Loken's own account stands as testament to the possibility of choosing principle over convenience, even when that choice led to exile and condemnation. I write these words knowing that few will believe them, and fewer still will act upon them, he concluded. Yet truth remains truth regardless of whether it is acknowledged. Horus Lupercal was the greatest of the Emperor's sons, and his fall represents the most terrible tragedy in human history. But his corruption does not invalidate the ideals he once embodied, any more than the failure of the Great Crusade invalidates the dream of human unity. Those ideals survive, waiting for new champions worthy of carrying them forward. Chapter 6: The Point of No Return. The testimony that follows comes from Brother Captain Iacton Cruz, the half-herd, whose advanced age and marginal status within the Luna Wolves allowed him to observe the final stages of Horus's corruption with unusual clarity. His account reveals how the War Master's transformation reached its inevitable conclusion in acts of betrayal that could never be undone. The orders came through official channels, Cruz wrote, his aged hand still steady despite the weight of what he was recording. 4 companies from each of the primary legions were to establish beachheads on Isstvan III, while orbital bombardment eliminated resistance in the outer territories. On the surface, it appeared to be a sound strategy for swift compliance. Yet something about the selection criteria for the landing forces troubled those of us with enough experience to recognize patterns. The choice of which companies would participate in the initial assault revealed a disturbing consistency across all 4 legions involved. Rather than sending their most effective assault troops, the Primarchs had selected units with high concentrations of Terran-born veterans, warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor predated their gene father's discoveries. Captain Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children expressed concerns about the composition of the landing force, Cruz recorded. He noted that many of the selected companies included veterans who had openly questioned some of the philosophical changes spreading through their legions. When he requested clarification about the selection criteria, he was told that the mission required warriors of unquestioned courage and loyalty. The virus bombing that followed was not an error or a miscommunication. It was the calculated murder of loyalist forces by their own Primarchs. The weapons used were not conventional orbital bombardment, but Life-Eater virus, a weapon so terrible that its use had been restricted to the most extreme circumstances. I watched from the observation deck as the virus cloud spread across Isstvan III's surface, Cruz wrote. his script becoming increasingly erratic as he struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The warriors we had sent to establish landing zones were consumed in minutes, their enhanced physiology providing no protection against weapons designed to destroy all organic matter. When I realized what was happening, I found myself weeping for the first time since my ascension to the Astartes. The firestorm that followed the virus attack was intended to eliminate any survivors and cleanse the planet's surface for reoccupation. Yet, some loyalists had managed to find shelter in deep bunkers and underground complexes, creating pockets of resistance that would complicate the traitors' plans. Captain Tarvitz's warning to the surface forces saved hundreds of lives, Crusade noted. His decision to break ranks and alert the landing teams about the impending bombardment was an act of heroism that prevented the complete success of the massacre. Yet it also ensured that the final phase of the rebellion would require ground assault rather than simple orbital sterilization. The revelation that 4 Primarchs had willingly murdered their own sons marked the point where the philosophical corruption that had been spreading through the legions transformed into active rebellion. There could be no return from such an act, no reconciliation with the Emperor after such betrayal. Horus addressed the surviving fleet personnel with explanations that would have seemed reasonable to those not aware of the true circumstances, Crusade recorded. He spoke of difficult but necessary decisions, of loyalty tests that had revealed dangerous corruption among the landing forces, of regrettable but unavoidable casualties in the larger war against tyranny. His words carried the same conviction that had once inspired us to follow him across the galaxy. The ground assault that followed the orbital bombardment provided cover for the systematic elimination of remaining loyalist elements throughout the expedition fleets. Warriors who had served with distinction for decades found themselves branded as traitors and marked for death by battle brothers they had trusted with their lives. The purge was thorough and efficient, Cruz wrote. Those suspected of excessive loyalty to the Emperor were given assignments that placed them in vulnerable positions, where they could be eliminated without raising questions about their deaths. Others were simply executed outright, their loyalty reframed as evidence of corruption by the very regime they had served faithfully. The psychological impact of these events on the surviving Legion members was precisely calculated to destroy their remaining connections to their former identities. By forcing them to participate in the murder of their brothers, the traitor Primarchs ensured that their forces could never return to Imperial service. The corruption became complete when we were forced to choose sides, Crusade observed. Those who refused to participate in the purges were eliminated as loyalist sympathizers. Those who participated found themselves bound to the rebellion by complicity in atrocities they could never confess or undo. The brotherhood that had once defined our legions was replaced by fear and mutual suspicion. The transformation of the Luna Wolves into the Sons of Horus was formalized during this period, symbolically representing the complete rejection of their original identity and purpose. The change was presented as evolution rather than corruption, a natural development that reflected their growing understanding of reality. The new name was supposed to honor the War Master's vision for humanity's future, Crusade recorded. Yet to those of us who remembered what the Luna Wolves had once represented, it felt like the death of everything we had once believed in. We were no longer the Emperor's loyal servants, but Horus's personal instruments, bound to his will rather than to any higher principle. The rituals that accompanied this transformation introduced explicitly chaotic elements into Legion practice for the first time. What had previously been suggested or implied now became open doctrine, with the worship of dark powers replacing the imperial truth as the foundation of their belief system. The lodge meetings became ceremonies, Cruz wrote with obvious revulsion. we were taught to invoke entities that existed beyond the material realm, to draw upon powers that the Emperor had forbidden us to acknowledge. Those who expressed discomfort with these practices were told that their reluctance reflected imperial conditioning rather than genuine moral conviction. The spread of mutation and psychic ability among the Legion members marked the final stage of their corruption. Warriors who had once been examples of human perfection began to exhibit changes that reflected their new allegiances, yet these transformations were presented as enhancements rather than degradation. Brother Captain Abaddon grew larger and stronger with each passing month, Cruz noted. His eyes began to glow with inner fire, and his voice carried harmonics that made weaker men tremble with fear or adoration. When questioned about these changes, he replied that he was becoming what the Emperor had always intended his sons to be, beings capable of transcending mortal limitations through alliance with cosmic forces. The point of no return had been crossed not in a single moment of decision, but through a series of seemingly reasonable choices that accumulated into damnation. By the time the full extent of their fall became apparent, the traitor legions were so deeply corrupted that redemption was no longer possible. I write these words as one of the last Luna Wolves remaining, Cruz concluded. My brothers have become something unrecognizable, their souls sold for promises of power and glory that will ultimately consume them. Yet I remember what they once were, and I believe that memory has value, even if it cannot change what they have become. Perhaps future generations will learn from our tragedy and find ways to avoid the mistakes that doomed us all. Chapter 7. The Architect of Ruin. The final testimony in this collection comes from a most unexpected source, Hastur Sejanus, the Luna Wolves' captain whose death on murder had preceded Horus's corruption by several months. His account was recovered from data cores deep within the Eye of Terror, where the immaterial nature of that realm had somehow preserved his consciousness beyond bodily death. I speak from a place between life and death, between reality and nightmare. Sejanus's disembodied voice was captured by techno-arcane means too dangerous to describe. My death on murder should have been final. Yet the same forces that corrupted my Primarch have kept my consciousness intact to witness the consequences of his fall. What I have seen in this realm of endless possibility has shown me the true scope of the tragedy that Horus's corruption represents. From his unique vantage point within the warp itself, Sejanus could perceive the supernatural architects of Horus's fall with clarity that had been impossible for those still bound by physical existence. His account reveals the calculated precision with which chaos had orchestrated the galaxy's greatest tragedy. The corruption of Horus was not opportunistic but planned, Sejanus revealed. The dark gods had been watching him since his discovery on Chthoniya, identifying the psychological vulnerabilities that could eventually be exploited. His need for approval, his fear of abandonment, his burden of responsibility. All of these were carefully cataloged and prepared for use when the moment was right. The entity that had spoken through Horus during the ritual on Davin was revealed to be a composite creature, drawing aspects from all four Chaos gods while maintaining the appearance of the War Master's own suppressed consciousness. This deception was crucial to the corruption's success, as it allowed Horus to believe he was acting on his own insights rather than following alien direction. The voice that guided Horus spoke with his own thoughts and concerns, Sejanus observed. It never demanded actions that contradicted his fundamental nature, instead encouraging him to pursue his existing desires through methods that gradually led him toward damnation. The genius of the corruption was that Horus never recognized it as external influence. He believed himself to be achieving clarity and self-actualization. The visions shown to Horus during his corruption contained carefully selected truths mixed with devastating lies. The Emperor's ultimate plans for humanity were indeed more complex than most understood, but the interpretations placed on those plans were deliberately twisted to suggest malevolent rather than benevolent intent. Horus was shown the Emperor's divinity, but not its purpose, Sejanus revealed. He saw the sacrifices that would be required to achieve the Emperor's vision, but not the rewards that such sacrifices would bring. Most critically, he was made to believe that he and his brothers were expendable tools rather than beloved sons whose welfare was central to their father's concerns. The systematic recruitment of other Primarchs followed patterns established during Horus's own corruption. Each brother was approached with arguments specifically crafted to exploit their individual psychological profiles, using their virtues as weapons against their loyalty. Fulgrim's perfectionism became a gateway to Slaaneshi influence, Sejanus noted. Angron's rage was channeled toward Cornate worship. Mortarian's desire for independence was twisted into service to Nurgle's entropy. Magnus's thirst for knowledge became a path to Tzeentchian manipulation. In each case, what appeared to be the fulfillment of their deepest nature was actually its corruption. The role of mortal agents in facilitating the corruption proved crucial to its success. Figures like Erebus, Corferin, and Luther served as bridges between the supernatural forces of chaos and the material realm, providing the practical means through which corruption could spread. These men had been prepared for their roles across decades or even centuries, Sejanus revealed. They were not random converts, but carefully cultivated assets whose own corruption preceded and enabled that of their superhuman masters. Their apparent humanity made them trustworthy in ways that obviously supernatural entities could never be. The timing of the rebellion was calculated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the Imperium's ability to respond effectively. The choice to begin with fratricide rather than direct assault on Imperial infrastructure was deliberate, designed to shatter morale and create doubt about the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial civilization. The goal was never simple military victory, Sejanus observed. Chaos sought to prove that the Emperor's vision was impossible, that his sons were fundamentally flawed, that humanity itself was incapable of the unity and transcendence he promised. The heresy was as much about destroying hope as about conquering territory. The transformation of the traitor legions from noble warriors into instruments of damnation followed patterns that reflected the specific nature of each Chaos God's influence. Yet in all cases, the corruption proceeded by enhancing existing traits rather than imposing alien characteristics. The World Eaters became more violent, but violence had always been their specialty, Sejanus noted. The Emperor's children became more obsessed with perfection, but perfection had always been their goal. The corruption was successful precisely because it felt like natural development rather than fundamental change. The ultimate tragedy of Horus's fall was that it represented the destruction of the galaxy's best hope for genuine unity and progress. The War Master had possessed all the qualities necessary to lead humanity to true greatness, yet those same qualities became the instruments of his corruption. Horus could have been everything the Emperor hoped, Sejanus reflected sadly. His charisma, his strategic brilliance, his genuine care for his followers, all of these could have served the cause of human advancement for millennia. Instead, they became weapons in the hands of forces that sought to drag our species back into darkness and despair. The psychological impact of Horus's betrayal extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The revelation that the Emperor's most trusted son could fall to corruption created doubt about the fundamental viability of the Imperial project that would persist for 10,000 years. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was not the enlightened civilization the Emperor had envisioned. Sejanus observed. It was a defensive structure built on fear and suspicion, more concerned with preventing another betrayal than with achieving the transcendence that had once seemed possible. Horus's fall didn't just damage the Imperium, it changed its essential nature. Yet, even from his vantage point within the realm of chaos itself, Sejanus retained hope that the tragedy he had witnessed might serve some greater purpose in humanity's ultimate development. Perhaps the lesson of Horus's fall was necessary, he concluded. Perhaps humanity needed to understand the price of corruption before it could achieve true immunity to such influence. The Emperor's vision may have been delayed rather than destroyed, waiting for a time when our species has learned to guard against the weaknesses that doomed my beloved Primarch. Chapter 8. The War of Brothers. The account that follows was compiled from multiple sources: Loyalist survivors, captured traitor communications, and reports from worlds caught between the warring factions. Together, they paint a picture of how Horus's personal corruption metastasized into a galaxy-spanning civil war that would determine humanity's fate. The first sign that something was wrong came from the silence, wrote Commander Thaddeus Hack of the Imperial Army. Expedition fleets that had maintained regular communication for decades suddenly went dark. Astropathic messages became garbled or stopped arriving entirely. When investigating forces finally reached these silent systems, they found either empty space where proud fleets had once sailed, or worse, familiar ships crewed by warriors who had been transformed into something no longer recognizably human. The revelation of the drop site massacre sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium that went far beyond its immediate military impact. 3 loyal legions had been decimated in a single engagement, but more devastating still was the proof that 7 Primarchs had turned against their father. The news reached Terra through fragmentary reports that nobody wanted to believe, recorded Malkador the Sigillite. We had prepared for external threats, for Xenos invasions and warp storms and 1,000 other dangers that plagued a galaxy-spanning empire. We had not prepared for the possibility that our greatest strength might become our greatest weakness, that the Emperor's own sons might lead the forces arrayed against us. The speed with which the rebellion spread demonstrated the thoroughness of Horus's preparations. Systems that had seemed completely loyal to the Imperium revealed themselves to have been corrupted for years, their populations systematically conditioned to accept the War Master's leadership when the moment came. Worlds that had never shown signs of heretical thought suddenly declared for Horus, wrote Planetary Governor Mordian Kane, whose own system remained loyal throughout the conflict. Their defense forces, their administrative officials, even their ecclesiarchy representatives spoke with one voice about the Emperor's tyranny and Horus's liberation. The coordination was too perfect to be spontaneous. These rebellions had been planned and prepared across decades. The psychological warfare employed by the traitor forces proved almost as devastating as their military campaigns. Rather than simply conquering worlds through force, they sought to convert populations by revealing truths about the Emperor's nature and the Imperium's ultimate purpose. They brought with them preachers who spoke of enlightenment, recorded Sister Immaculata of the Orders Militant. These false prophets claimed that the Emperor had deceived humanity about its true potential, that he had suppressed knowledge and abilities that could elevate our species beyond mortal limitations. Their arguments were sophisticated and emotionally compelling, addressing real grievances and genuine concerns that many citizens harbored about imperial rule. The corruption of entire populations proceeded with terrifying efficiency. Worlds that had been bastions of imperial loyalty for centuries found themselves transformed into recruitment centers for chaos cults, their citizens embracing ideologies that would have horrified them months earlier. The changes were gradual at first, wrote Arbite's Marshal Jorik Grimm. Citizens began questioning laws they had previously accepted without thought. Workers started demanding modifications to their labor that would have been considered heretical under normal circumstances. Artists and scholars pursued knowledge that had been forbidden for good reason. By the time we recognized the pattern, the corruption had spread too far to contain through conventional means. The traitor legions themselves underwent transformations that reflected their new allegiances. Warriors who had once been exemplars of human potential began exhibiting mutations and abilities that marked them as servants of dark powers. Brother Captain Lucius appeared before the walls of Prandium wearing armor that had fused with his flesh, recorded Captain Saul Tarvitz, one of the few Emperor's children to remain loyal. His pursuit of perfection had led him to embrace changes that would have been considered abominations just months earlier. When I called out to him, appealing to our brotherhood and shared history, he laughed with a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should produce. The loyal forces found themselves fighting an enemy that possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics, equipment, and psychology. The traitor legions could anticipate Loyalist strategies because they had helped develop them, could counter Imperial technologies because they had access to the same resources, could exploit weaknesses because they had served alongside their enemies for decades. "We faced ourselves in battle," wrote Captain Alexis Pollux of the Imperial Fists. "Every formation we deployed, they had a counter for. Every strategy we employed, they had anticipated. Every weakness we tried to exploit, they had already prepared to defend. It was like fighting our own shadows, familiar yet distorted, recognizable yet fundamentally alien." The siege of Terra marked the culmination of the traitor advance, as 9 corrupted legions brought their full force to bear against the heart of the Imperium. The scale of the assault defied comprehension, with millions of warriors and thousands of war machines converging on humanity's birth world. The approach to Sol was visible from Terra's surface as a second galaxy, recorded Admiral Constantine Page of the Solar Defense Fleet. Their ships blotted out entire constellations. Their warp signatures created auroras that painted the sky in unnatural colors. When they began their bombardment, the void shields protecting the Imperial Palace flared so brightly that day became indistinguishable from night. The corruption that had claimed Horus became manifest during the siege in ways that transcended mere physical transformation. The War Master, who had once been the Emperor's most trusted son, now radiated malevolent power that could break the will of mortals with a glance. "I saw him stride across the battlefield like a figure from nightmare," wrote Colonel Mord of the Imperial Army. "He stood 3 meters tall, his armor wreathed in energies that hurt to look upon directly. Where he walked, the very ground withered and died. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made strong men fall to their knees in terror or adoration." This was not the noble Primarch who had led the Great Crusade to victory. This was something that had consumed him from within and worn his face as a mask. The final confrontation between father and son aboard the Vengeful Spirit was witnessed by few and understood by fewer still. Yet those present recorded details that revealed the true scope of the tragedy that Horus's corruption represented. "The Emperor faced his son with sorrow rather than anger," wrote Custodian Aquilon, one of the few survivors of the boarding action. Even after everything Horus had done, even knowing that this confrontation could only end in death, the Emperor still hoped for redemption. It was only when Horus murdered Sanguinius before his father's eyes that the last hope for salvation died. The Emperor's victory came at a cost that would reshape the Imperium's entire future. In destroying Horus utterly, wiping his soul from existence to prevent any possibility of resurrection, the Emperor exhausted powers that could never be fully recovered. When we found the Emperor, his body was broken beyond healing, recorded Rogel Dorn, whose account of those final moments remains one of the most painful documents in Imperial history. He had won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The golden figure who had united Terra and launched the Great Crusade was gone, replaced by a broken shell, sustained only by the Golden Throne's arcane machinery. The aftermath of Horus's fall left the Imperium fundamentally changed. The optimistic expansion that had characterized the Great Crusade was replaced by defensive paranoia, the pursuit of knowledge abandoned in favor of rigid orthodoxy, the dream of human transcendence replaced by the grim necessity of survival. We had lost more than a war, reflected Malcador in his final recordings. We had lost our future, the bright tomorrow that the Emperor had promised, the elevation of humanity to something greater than it had ever been. All of it died with Horus on that accursed ship. What remained was merely the machinery of empire, running on momentum and fear rather than hope and vision. Chapter 9. The Price of Betrayal. The testimonies that follow come from the scattered survivors of the heresy's aftermath. Loyalists who witnessed the immediate consequences of Horus's fall and the desperate measures required to prevent the Imperium's complete collapse. Their words reveal how the price of the War Master's betrayal extended far beyond the immediate casualties of civil war. The Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne was not just a medical necessity but a symbolic death, wrote Captain General Constantine Valdor of the Adeptus Custodes. The being who had walked among us as father, general, and visionary was replaced by a silent figure whose consciousness was focused entirely on maintaining the psychic beacon that allowed navigation through the warp. We had saved the Imperium, but we had lost the Emperor, perhaps forever. The establishment of the daily sacrifice required to sustain the Golden Throne represented a fundamental transformation in imperial ideology. What had once been a civilization dedicated to reason and scientific progress became one that demanded the literal consumption of human souls to maintain its basic functions. 1,000 psychers every day, recorded Inquisitor Yashu Creed, one of the first members of that newly established order. Their life force channeled through mechanisms that even the Mechanicus barely understood, their sacrifice necessary to prevent the Emperor's death and the collapse of interstellar travel. We told ourselves it was a temporary measure, a stopgap until better solutions could be found. 10 millennia later, we still tell ourselves the same lie. The dissolution of the Space Marine Legions marked the end of the military structure that had made the Great Crusade possible. The Codex Astartes, while necessary to prevent future large-scale rebellions, also ensured that humanity would never again possess the unified force needed for truly ambitious expansion. We broke apart the greatest military instrument in human history, wrote Reboot Gilliman, whose codex would reshape the Astartes for millennia to come. The chapter system provides security against another Horus-scale rebellion, but it also guarantees that we will never again possess the unified strength to push back the darkness as we once did. We chose safety over potential, survival over greatness. The psychological impact of the heresy created lasting changes in imperial culture that went far beyond military reorganization. The revelation that the Emperor's own sons could fall to corruption generated paranoia that permeated every level of society. Trust became a luxury we could no longer afford, recorded Lord Commander Militant Kirill Sinderman. Every citizen was a potential heretic, every official a possible traitor, every innovation a gateway to corruption. The Inquisition was established not just to combat chaos, but to monitor the loyalty of our own people. We became an empire that feared its own subjects almost as much as its external enemies. The suppression of knowledge and technology that had begun during the heresy accelerated in its aftermath. Entire fields of study were declared too dangerous for mortal minds, while innovations that might have advanced human civilization were abandoned out of fear that they could lead to corruption. The men of iron had rebelled during the dark age of technology, wrote Fabricator General Kane. Artificial intelligence was forbidden because it had nearly destroyed humanity once before. But after the heresy, we extended those prohibitions to cover any knowledge that might challenge imperial orthodoxy. We chose ignorance as our shield against corruption, not understanding that ignorance itself could become a form of darkness. The establishment of the imperial cult represented perhaps the most profound betrayal of the emperor's original vision. The being who had fought to eliminate religion from human civilization was transformed into the object of worship for the largest religious movement in galactic history. He would have been horrified, wrote one of the last surviving members of the imperial truth movement, whose identity must remain hidden even 10 millennia later. The emperor's rejection of religious belief was absolute. He viewed faith as a crutch that prevented humanity from reaching its true potential. Yet, in death, or near death, he became the foundation for a faith more powerful and oppressive than any religion he had ever opposed. The retreat of the surviving loyal Primarchs from active leadership deprived the Imperium of its greatest assets during its most vulnerable period. Whether through death, disappearance, or withdrawal into stasis, the Emperor's remaining sons abandoned the realm they had helped build. They could not bear to see what we had become, reflected High Lord Clement Vex. Roboute Guilliman's withdrawal into stasis after his encounter with Fulgrim was symbolic of a broader retreat. The Primarchs had been created to lead humanity to greatness, but that dream had died with Horus. What remained was merely survival, and survival was not sufficient to sustain beings who had been designed for transcendence. The establishment of the High Lords of Terra as the Imperium's governing body replaced the Emperor's direct rule with a bureaucratic structure that prioritized stability over progress. The single vision that had driven the Great Crusade was replaced by committee rule that often struggled to coordinate effective responses to emerging threats. 12 voices speaking where once there had been one, recorded Planetary Governor Meridian Holt. Each High Lord represented a different aspect of imperial governance, yet their meetings often devolved into territorial disputes that delayed crucial decisions. The unity of purpose that had made the Great Crusade possible was replaced by political maneuvering that served individual interests rather than humanity's collective welfare. The loss of the Webway project represented perhaps the most devastating long-term consequence of Horus's betrayal. The Emperor's secret work to free humanity from dependence on warp travel was abandoned, leaving the species vulnerable to the very forces that had corrupted his favorite son. We remain trapped in a galaxy where every journey risks exposure to chaos, wrote Navigator Pacificus. The Webway would have provided safe passage between the stars, eliminating our dependence on the warp and the entities that dwell within it. Instead, we continue to feed those same entities with every ship that translates between systems, every psyker whose power draws their attention, every act of desperation that makes their influence seem attractive. The cultural stagnation that followed the heresy transformed the Imperium from a dynamic expansion force into a defensive structure focused primarily on maintaining what it had already achieved. Innovation was discouraged, questioning authority became heretical, and the pursuit of knowledge was subordinated to the preservation of orthodox belief. We became curators of our own decline, observed Remembrancer Michael Vintrus, one of the last practitioners of that suppressed order. The vibrant culture that had driven the Great Crusade, its curiosity, its optimism, its belief in human potential, was replaced by rigid orthodoxy that valued conformity over creativity. We survived, but we stopped growing. We endured, but we ceased to thrive. The final testimony in this section comes from an unexpected source: the Emperor himself, in one of the few communications transmitted from the Golden Throne during the early years of his internment. "My greatest son became my greatest enemy," the message read, recorded by the most sensitive psychic equipment available to the Adeptus Mechanicus. "In seeking to save him, I doomed myself. In trying to preserve the future, I condemned the present. The Imperium that emerges from this crisis will not be the one I envisioned. It will be harder, more suspicious, more willing to sacrifice the individual for the collective. Perhaps such transformation is necessary. Perhaps the lesson of Horus's fall is that humanity must learn to guard against its own weaknesses before it can achieve true transcendence. I pray that future generations will prove worthy of the dream that died with my beloved son." Chapter 10. The Eternal Wound. The final chapter of this tragic chronicle draws from sources that span the 10 millennia since Horus's fall, revealing how the War Master's betrayal continues to shape the Imperium's destiny long after his death. These testimonies come from those who have glimpsed the deeper patterns of history and understood that some wounds never truly heal. "I have lived for 5,000 years," wrote Lord Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, his words heavy with the accumulated sorrow of millennia. "I have seen the Imperium face threats that would have destroyed lesser civilizations, yet we endure. But in all my centuries of service, I have come to understand that our greatest enemy was never the Xenos or the demon. It was the wound left by Horus's betrayal, a spiritual injury that festers in the heart of every Imperial citizen. The black rage that afflicts the Blood Angels serves as a living reminder of the heresy's psychological trauma. Brother Marines who succumb to this madness experience their Primarch's final moments as if they were their own memories, reliving Sanguinius's death at Horus's hands with such intensity that it drives them to suicidal fury. They die believing they are Sanguinius facing the War Master," recorded Chaplain Asterath the Grim. "In their final moments, they experience not just the physical pain of death, but the emotional agony of witnessing a beloved brother's ultimate corruption. The black rage is more than genetic flaw. It is the crystallized grief of a legion that can never forgive the betrayal of everything they once held sacred. The Imperium's relationship with its own history has been fundamentally shaped by the need to suppress knowledge of Horus's true nature. The War Master, who was once celebrated as the greatest of the Emperor's sons, has been transformed into a figure of such pure evil that even speaking his name is considered heretical. We have rewritten the past to make the present bearable," admitted Inquisitor Lord Fyodor Karamazov. "The official histories describe Horus as a monster from birth, a creature of corruption who never truly loved his father or brothers. This narrative is comfortable because it suggests that his fall was inevitable, that there was nothing we could have done to prevent it. The truth, that he was genuinely noble before his corruption, is too painful for most minds to accept. The recurring appearance of chaos cults throughout the Imperium often follows patterns that echo Horus's own fall. Charismatic leaders who begin with noble intentions gradually succumb to corruption, bringing their followers with them into damnation through promises of transcendence and liberation. They always begin the same way," observed witch hunter Mordecai Kane. "A leader emerges who questions unjust authority, who promises relief from suffering, who offers hope to the desperate. Their early teachings often contain genuine wisdom, and their initial actions may actually benefit their communities. Only gradually does the corruption reveal itself, and by then it is usually too late to save anyone involved. The worship of the Emperor as a god represents perhaps the most profound irony of the post-heresy Imperium. The being who fought to eliminate religion from human civilization has become the object of the most powerful faith in galactic history, while his vision of rational enlightenment has been replaced by dogmatic orthodoxy. "He would weep to see what we have become," reflected Cardinal Voss of the Ecclesiarchy, speaking in private to his confessor. The imperial cult that sustains our civilization is built upon the systematic rejection of everything the Emperor originally stood for. We worship him as a god while betraying his vision of human potential. We pray to him for salvation while refusing to pursue the knowledge and understanding that might actually provide it. The continuing threat posed by the Chaos Space Marines serves as a constant reminder that the heresy's consequences extend far beyond its immediate aftermath. The traitor legions that fled into the Eye of Terror continue to launch raids against Imperial space, bringing with them not just military threats, but ideological challenges to the foundations of Imperial society. They carry with them the memory of what we once were, wrote Chapter Master Azrael of the Dark Angels. When they speak of the Great Crusade's ideals, when they remind us of the Emperor's original vision, they force us to confront the distance between what we are and what we were meant to become. Their very existence is a reproach to our diminished state. The recurring prophecies about the Emperor's eventual awakening reflect humanity's deep-seated longing for redemption from the consequences of Horus's betrayal. These beliefs suggest that the current age of suffering is merely a trial that will ultimately be resolved by their godfather's return to active leadership. The faithful speak of the Emperor rising from the Golden Throne to lead a new great crusade, recorded Canoness Superior Sabrina of the Adepta Sororitas. They envision a future where the mistakes of the past are corrected, where humanity reclaims its destiny among the stars. Yet, I sometimes wonder if such dreams represent hope or denial, an inability to accept that some wounds may be too deep to heal. The emergence of figures like Robert Guilliman from Stasis has created new possibilities for addressing the heresy's legacy, yet it has also highlighted how profoundly the Imperium has changed since its founding. The Primarch's attempts to reform imperial institutions face resistance from entrenched interests that have benefited from the current system's dysfunction. Lord Guilliman sees clearly the problems that plague our civilization, wrote High Lord Militant Constantine Valdor. His strategic genius remains unimpaired. His understanding of effective governance still exceeds that of any mortal administrator. Yet he struggles against 10 millennia of institutional inertia, 10,000 years of accumulated prejudice and fear. The Imperium has become so accustomed to decline that it resists even beneficial change. The psychological impact of the heresy continues to manifest in the Imperium's obsession with loyalty tests and purity examinations. Citizens throughout the galaxy live under constant surveillance, their every action scrutinized for signs of corruption or heretical thought. "We have become a civilization that trusts no one," observed Arbitrator General Lysander Creed. "Every citizen is a potential traitor, every innovation a possible gateway to corruption." The paranoia that began with the revelation of Horus's betrayal has metastasized into a system that assumes guilt rather than innocence, that values conformity over creativity. The Primaris Space Marines created by Archmagos Call represent an attempt to address the genetic flaws that contributed to the original Legion's corruption. Yet their very existence raises questions about whether humanity can truly transcend the weaknesses that led to the heresy. "They are superior to us in every measurable way," admitted Captain Cassius of the Ultramarines. "Stronger, faster, more resilient to both physical and psychic corruption. Yet I wonder if they truly understand what they have inherited. We who bear the scars of the heresy know the price of trust betrayed. These new warriors have never experienced such loss. Perhaps that innocence is a strength, or perhaps it is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. The ongoing war against chaos serves as a constant reminder that the conflict which began with Horus's fall will never truly end. Each generation of Imperial citizens must face the same temptations that destroyed the War Master, must choose between loyalty and corruption under circumstances that often make the right choice unclear. The war continues because the conflict is internal as much as external, reflected Saint Celestine during one of her manifestations. Chaos does not seek merely to conquer our worlds, but to corrupt our souls. Every human heart contains the potential for both transcendence and damnation. The choice that faced Horus faces us all, every day, in countless small decisions that cumulatively determine our fate. The final testimony comes from an unexpected source, a fragment of Horus's own consciousness, somehow preserved within the warp despite the Emperor's attempt to utterly destroy his corrupted son. These words, recovered at tremendous cost by agents of the Inquisition, provide a glimpse into the eternal torment of the galaxy's greatest traitor. "I see what I have wrought," the fragment whispered through a possessed psyker before immolating both itself and its host. 10,000 years of darkness where there should have been light, 10 millennia of fear where there should have been hope. I, who loved my father more than life itself, became the instrument of his greatest sorrow. I, who dreamed of human transcendence, condemned our species to perpetual twilight. Yet, even in my torment, I remember the nobility that once defined me. Perhaps that memory serves some purpose. Perhaps the knowledge of what I was reminds the galaxy of what it might still become. Closing reflection. As I close this collection of testimonies and return these ancient documents to their sealed vault, I am struck by the terrible continuity that connects Horus's personal tragedy to the Imperium's ongoing decline. The War Master's fall was not simply a historical event, but a wound in the galaxy's soul that continues to bleed 10 millennia later. The testimonies I have gathered reveal a truth that official histories prefer to obscure. Horus Lupercal was not born evil, was not destined for corruption from the moment of his creation. He was genuinely noble, authentically loyal, truly worthy of the trust his father placed in him. His fall was not inevitable, but contingent, the result of specific choices made under particular circumstances that might have been avoided with different decisions or better understanding. This makes his betrayal infinitely more tragic than if he had simply been flawed from the beginning. The galaxy lost not just a great general, but a great man. Not just a powerful weapon, but a noble soul. The corruption of such genuine goodness represents a victory for the dark powers that transcends any merely military triumph. Yet, even in the depths of this tragedy, there are lessons that might yet serve humanity's cause. Horus fell not because he was weak, but because he was strong. Not because he cared too little, but because he cared too much. His very virtues became the instruments of his destruction when they were manipulated by forces that understood them better than he understood himself. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy may be a diminished thing compared to the bright dream of the Great Crusade, but it endures. 10,000 years of decline have not broken humanity's will to survive, have not entirely extinguished the potential for greatness that once burned so brightly. Perhaps the long age of suffering that followed Horus's fall was necessary preparation for some future renaissance, a time when humanity will have learned to guard against the weaknesses that once doomed its greatest son. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there was once something more, something greater, something worthy of the highest aspirations of the human spirit. That memory lives on in the testimonies of those who witnessed both the heights of nobility and the depths of corruption. As long as that memory survives, the possibility remains that what was lost might someday be reclaimed. The favored son became the greatest traitor, but he was once the greatest son. In remembering both his glory and his fall, we honor not just what he was, but what we all might become, whether for good or ill. The choice that faced Horus Lupercal faces us still, in every generation, in every heart. May we prove worthier of the trust placed in us than even the best of the Emperor's sons proved to be. Warmaster I followed to glory across 1,000 worlds is gone, replaced by something that wears his face but speaks with the voice of damnation. Yet I remember him as he was, and I believe that memory deserves preservation, even if none survive to read these words. As I read by candlelight in my study high above the hive spires of Malacandria, I found myself transported not to the blood-soaked battlefields of the heresy, but to quieter moments when a demigod had walked among mortals and been loved for his humanity, rather than feared for his power. These testimonies revealed a truth that propaganda had buried. Horus Lupercal had not been born evil. His corruption was a tragedy of the highest order, the systematic destruction of everything noble in one of the finest beings the galaxy had ever produced. What follows is their story, told in the voices of those who witnessed it unfold. It is not a tale of simple villainy, but of how the brightest light can cast the darkest shadow, and how love itself can become the instrument of the most devastating betrayal.